My name is Brianna Last, and I'm the chair of the Political Education Committee in Philly DSA. I want to thank you all for coming to our Marxism and Politics lecture series. We're really excited to have Anton Jäger here. Before I let Anton take it away, I wanted to offer some introductory remarks about our lecture series and then briefly introduce our speaker. I also want to make a brief announcement. Very unfortunately, Dr. Adolphe Jr., who was going to moderate the Q&A, had a very last-minute family emergency, so he's unable to attend tonight. But I think we'll still have a really exciting conversation with Anton and learn a lot. So, really excited for the talk. So, I know I hear like a collective sigh in the room. So the idea for this lecture series developed out of our chapter's Marxism and Politics reading group, which for the past 2 years has been reading foundational texts in Marxist theory and history. So we began, as all good socialist reading groups do, with Marx's Capital Volume 1, and have since read other texts from the canon informed by Marx's description of society as a class society. And the purpose of the reading group was to engage in Marx's texts and think about different practices for social transformation. Inspired by Marx's famous last line in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. The group examined and developed a theory of politics pioneered by Marx in light of the intervening history, and with the tools of, if you can believe it, non-Marxist social science and philosophy. Through these readings, our group developed a deeper understanding of the political and strategic problems faced by those who sought to intervene in history. And these readings allowed us to conduct a rigorous analysis of past and present social conditions. So out of this group, we decided to invite speakers, political analysts, and historians from around the country who are examining situations that socialists examine. We've had Renee Rojas, who's written on the pink tide in Latin America, Matt Karp, who's written on the history of the American Republican Party, and Adana Usmani, who writes about the social determinants of mass incarceration. Looks like we are having more chairs, folks. Tonight we're delighted to have Anton Jäger speak about populism, a now widely used term which has lost its original meaning. And Jäger will map out the ever-shifting definitions of the word, describe its new form as an anti-particularist identity politics, hostile to party formation, and offer a way forward for a populism beyond identity. So I'm going to introduce Anton, and then I'll have him take it away. So Anton Jäger is a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge, working on the history of populism in the United States and its importance for current debates. His writings have appeared in outlets such as Jacobin, the London Review of Books, and Non-Site and the New Statesman, together with Daniel Zamora. He's currently working on an intellectual history of basic income. And like I said, tonight he'll be delivering a lecture on populism beyond identity. So let's give a round of applause.
Can everybody hear me? Oh yeah, of course. So I want to thank Dustin and Brianna for inviting me in the first place. I know I kind of have to compensate for Adol's absence. It's quite unfortunate that he's not here, but I hope I will not bore you to death for the next 45 minutes, so please keep your mind focused. So I would actually like to present 3 theses on populism today, or there's 3 separate issues I would like to talk about. The first is actually a history of how we came to talk about populism, or the phenomenon of populism, in a specific way, and how this was historically conditioned. Now, know that the concept of populism, or the topic of populism, is an annoyingly topical topic. So it has fueled a massive academic gold rush. You have a lot of academic specialists who are rebranding as populism specialists. It doesn't always have the prettiest results. and you have a flurry of public commentary on a topic which tends to be as overheated as it is uninteresting. So one of the main questions asked about populism discourse today, is it even possible to say something new about populism? Is it even possible to say something interesting? I think it is. I hope I will convince you that what I have to say is interesting enough. I think there are actually some underexplored issues in the populism literature that bear revisiting. And I want to talk about how a term that was originally coined in American debates made its way into Europe with its very specific definition. And despite it had the fact that it had very flimsy empirical support, when that definition was launched, it kind of attracted a lot of support, mainly in the 1980s and 1990s, when there was a very specific crisis of representation, mainly in Europe. So I will say I will be mainly talking about American and European debates, and kind of leaving Latin America out of the equation in this case. There are loads of other discussions on populism in other regional settings that I'm not discussing, but I'm happy to touch on them in the Q&A. So it's a kind of transatlantic discussion, but we can go beyond that later. And finally, I want to show why this particular definition of populism has such attractiveness today, and why this might limit our political imagination as socialists more openly, and why we don't think populism in a more interesting way. Now, so the first thesis, which is really a genealogy of how we came to talk about populism in a certain way, I want to start with two instances of what I could call political culture shock. So it's a culture shock between Americans and Europeans. Americans seem to have a very different way of talking about populism. The first example is a speech from 2016 made by Obama. So this was at the time that Trump was already in the election run, and in the time in Europe, Trump was regularly portrayed as a populist. And there was one moment in the press conference in Canada when a journalist asked Obama, what do you think of Trump's rhetoric as a populist? And Obama actually gave a really, really interesting response to it. And this is what he said. You know, the reason I ran in 2008, and it's here, and the reason I ran again, and the reason even after I leave this office, I will continue to work in some capacity in public office, because I care about people and want to make sure every kid in America has the same opportunities I had. Now, I suppose that makes me a populist. Now, somebody else who has never shown any regard for workers, has never fought on behalf of social justice issues, who has in fact worked against economic opportunity for workers, for elderly people, they don't suddenly become populist because they say something controversial in order to win votes. That's not the measure of populism. That's nativism or xenophobia, or worse, it's just cynicism. I would advise everybody to be careful about suddenly attributing to whoever pops up at the time of economic anxiety the label that they're populist. Now, I think we need to remind ourselves of certain facts here. Obama supported NAFTA, the latest Canadian trade deal. He supported Macron in the French election. This is someone who came out against Brexit. This is someone who was pretty vocal about Bernie's participation in the election as well. But still, he found it very difficult to use the word populism in that exclusively pejorative sense. So even for someone who's firmly in the center, or the right center in America, still found this European usage of the word populism very, very weird. And I want to give a second example of this culture shock. And this is actually from an interview in 2017 with the American economist James Galbraith, who teaches at Texas. And this is with the German Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which asked him a question about the recent emergence of populism in a European setting. So the German magazine asked, obviously the threat or the challenge of populism, especially right-wing populism, is not unique to the United States. If you broaden the discussion a little bit, what would you recommend? How should progressive parties in the US and beyond react to the challenge that right-wing populism poses? Galbraith gives a very interesting answer, which I think again speaks to this culture shock. He says, I dislike the term populism as a general purpose pejorative in politics, because it tends to be used by members of the professional classes to describe political appeals to, let's say, working class constituencies. Populism in the United States in the late 19th century was a former labor movement. It was a movement of debtors against creditors, of easy money and silver advocates against gold advocates, and that was the essence of it. I find a lot to identify with it in that tradition. So I'm not inclined to say dismissively that one should be opposed to populism. The Democratic Party's problem is that it had a core in the New Deal liberal period that was rooted in the organized labor movement, the working class and trade unions. And then he goes on and gives a kind of micro-history of Democratic Party development. But it's very clear that both Obama and James Galbraith, who's firmer on the left, they both find it very, very difficult to actually accept the European usages of the word populism. Now the question is, how do we actually understand the existence of this culture shock? So where does it actually come from? And the first thing to notice is that the word populism is actually quite a latecomer in our political vocabulary. So I'm speaking to an audience of Americans, and surely most of the people in the room will be familiar at what party launched the term initially. But it actually pops up for the first time in 1891. So this is when the American People's Party is launching its third party bet. It's running against Democrats and Republicans. And they basically have a problem because a member of the Democratic Party is called a Democrat, a member of the Republican Party is called a Republican. What do you call a member of the People's Party? And one senator from Kansas has the idea to say, like, well, we could just call them populists, so you don't have to say member of the People's Party. And this is when the word is actually used for the very, very first time. And if we track the usage of the word through the early 20th century, we can actually see that for a long time it's an exclusively American affair. It's only used in English. So the first European usages really start popping up in the 1930s in France, some parts in England, but it's really, really very, very marginal. It takes a really long time before Europeans start using the word populism. In the 1950s, of course, you have a Latin American discourse that starts to rise, and it's only in the 60s and 70s that European political science starts using the word populism. And then in the 70s and 80s, as we see here, you have an absolute explosion of commentary on the topic. So I think we need to come to terms with the fact that it's such a late arrival on the scene, and we see what are the drivers of its popularity in these particular periods. I want to show this with some other graphs. For example, it's not just the case that it's the same as demagoguery. So demagoguery is its own weird semantic history, doesn't quite add up. And we can see this even with the French case. So in French, the word populism is really only used in the early 20s, then you have a slight spike in the 30s, and its real rise only starts quite late, in the 1980s. So it's really in the last 40, 30 years that that word has become omnipresent in those political discourses. So here's some other languages. Here is German, which has an even later arrival. It's mainly in the 1990s that have that big rise. And here is the Italian one. So, I mean, Italian populism is all around nowadays. You supposedly have two populist parties in government. Still, it took a long time for that word to be introduced. Here's a very ugly graph, which is the Dutch. The Dutch don't have a proper database. It's a backward country. I'm from Belgium myself, so I can relate to this. But even there, the tendency is very clear. The tendential rate is absolutely pointing to the fact that people started using the word populism very late. And actually, if we zoom in more closely on these statistics, you can actually locate, and so I'm going to go back to the English one first, you can actually locate the moment at which the word populism really, really starts to rise. So this is the moment that exponential increase starts to go on. And it's actually situated somewhere towards the end of this graph, which is in 1955. This is really where you can locate a sort of mathematical tipping point at which it starts to go off. Something very interesting happens in 1955, because the book that was published in 1955 is Richard Hofstadter's Age of Reform. Now, for students of history in this class, or people who have taken an American history class, you will probably have read that book. It's probably been called the most influential book of American history written in the 20th century. And it also was, of course, Richard Hofstadter, who you can see here, and this is the initial cover of the book in 1955. And when you look at every book that's published in English in the 1960s and 1970s, there are always consistent references to this work by Hofstadter. So there is something about the thesis presented in that book that exercises an undeniable attraction on how political analysis of populism is conducted after, and he's a kind of real trendsetter as it comes to that. So what were the theses that Hofstadter presented in this book? And actually what he did is that he offered a really, really stark reassessment of how historians have viewed the populist past before. So populism died in 1896 when it fused with the Democrats and lost to the Republicans. And in the early years of the 20th century, there's actually not that much historiography of populism around. It's only really in the 1920s when you have progressive and frontier historians who start to write histories of populism, and they're generally quite laudatory. So they see the populists as inheritors of a kind of Jeffersonian small democracy ideal. They see them as fighters against big corporate corruption. They see them as an attempt to salvage this Republican legacy for a time of imperialism, basically. So they tend to also situate these populists on the left. It's very much seen as a predecessor to American socialism. Eugene V. Debs himself was a populist in the 1890s. And although some people are quite critical, they firmly place this within a New Deal trajectory. So they say populists were the predecessors to the New Deal. They first proposed all the legislation that only became reality in the 1930s. Now, Hofstadter's assessment in The Age of Reform is a self-conscious break with this previous vision. So to him, the populists were not crypto-socialists, or they were not New Dealers in the 1890s, but rather he called them the forebears of the paranoid style in American politics. This is a term that's actually enjoyed quite a resurgence in the last 10 years. It's a highly problematic term, but you can see why the commentariat tends to use it so much. So what Hofstadter did in the book is that he drew a sort of contrast between the agrarian myth of populism and the commercial realities of the late 19th century. So he said, actually the farmers were posturing as victims of big corporations and of banks, when in reality they were actually commercially doing quite well. It was precisely because they were shut out of the corporate economy that they engaged in political action, that they became frustrated with the American government. So they were not really victims of economic distress, but rather they were the result of America's Jeffersonian ideal, or this kind of pastoral ideal of the small farmer, crashing into these new realities of the late 19th century. So he initiates a very, very interesting shift, and I think we need to pause at this shift, which is that before Hofstadter, populism, or American populism, is mainly discussed as an economic movement. It's an economic interest movement that had certain political demands and try to translate those political demands into policy through representation. But after Hofstadter, populism really becomes an instance of what you could call cultural politics. It becomes a symbolic politics of people appealing to homogenous people that can then translate its will to the state. So there's a clear shift from the economy to culture, and there's a clear shift from class to status, or identity as it's called after that, which happens in 1959. Now you actually have a massive, massive historiographical debate on Hofstadter's thesis in the 1960s. It's called the most bloody episode in American historiography. You had instances of, I mean, yeah, this sounds quite unexciting, I guess so. But you had instances of the American Historical Association in 1958 in which people were literally shouting at Hofstadter about this book. He was banned from certain academic meetings. And a lot of people were very frustrated because in a public setting the book sold very well, but scholars thought it was absolutely bogus and based on very, very bad evidence. And actually the most interesting respondent to Hofstadter was the Southern historian Comer Van Woodward, who maybe some people in the room will know. Woodward is really the most famous post-war historian of the South. He trained a lot of the famous current historians, such as the Field sisters, both trained with him. And he was a close friend with Hofstadter, but he fiercely, fiercely disagreed with the thesis presented in The Age of Reform. For example, he attacked this shift Hofstadter initiated from class to status very fiercely, where he said, like, well, we can't really claim the populists weren't economic reformers. We can't really claim that it was just about status. So this is a letter he wrote in 1959. The populists may have been bitten by status anxieties, but if so, they were certainly not bred of upward social mobility, and probably few by downward mobility. And so most of these reform programs were pretty run-of-the-mill, he said, and actually populists had a pretty realistic vision of what was wrong with America in the late 19th century. And interestingly enough, yeah, this is a picture of the original populists in 1892. But interestingly enough, this does lead to some reconsideration on behalf of Hofstadter. So by the late 1960s, you have a whole cascade of academic works that criticize his thesis and say this is untenable. And he himself begins to acknowledge that, that he's made a mistake in 1955. So this actually becomes visible in a conference he attends in London in 1967, where he has to present his work on populism. And there he says, the kind of genetic affiliation I posited between populism and McCarthyism, or populism and the paranoid style, was wrong. It was doubtless miscarried, as he says. Although the populists did twang some McCarthyite strings, McCarthy was not really a substantial populist. This became even clearer in a book which is under review here, which is Populism, Meaning and National Characteristics, published in 1969, in which Hofstadter actually presented a chapter on the American populist. What he did in that chapter, really interestingly, is that he completely rebuked the thesis he had presented in 1955 and said, well, I have to agree they were basically economic reformers. So he ended the chapter by saying, despite certain credulous and delusive elements in populist thought, the populist movement of the 1890s seems on balance to have been something of an educational force. Now, this book is published, And what happens in 1969 is that the word populism has already spread beyond American academia, and it's now being used by European political scientists. So in the same book that Hofstadter writes its chapter, you have something on Nazism, you have something on Maoism, you have something on Bourgeoisism, and they all apply the status frame he used in 1955 to movements outside of America. And interestingly enough, Theodore Salutis, who is cited here, who's an American historian who engages with Hofstadter in the late 50s, reads the book, and again he experiences this sense of culture shock. So I'm just going to read off the quote because it's pretty damning, but it's also pretty interesting to see how American historians relate to the populism discussion. The limited and superficial treatment given to sweeping topics hardly does justice to them, the collaborators and the publishers. The term populism is misused and abused in the opinion of the reviewer. Setting up a qualified definition of it would have given the volume a sense of cohesion, but as it now stands, it lacks focus, it is amorphous and cluttered with a mass of undigested data that prompt one to label it a serious mistake. And even this is a charitable evaluation. So you can see how displeased the American historical profession is with how the word populism is being used on the other side of the Atlantic. And actually it's very interesting because a lot of recent theorists of populists, such as Jan van der Müller here, are actually very well aware of this problem. So this book, which was published in 2016, is really now seen as a standard work of political theory on populism. What Müller does at the end of the book is a really, really interesting maneuver. So he says, my theory of populism says it's basically anti-pluralist, it's against liberal democracy, it's an exclusive form of politics, and liberals and Democrats and even socialists should have nothing to do with it. But then he says, well, my definition of populism doesn't really apply to the late 19th century. So he teaches at Princeton, he knows this counter-revisionist literature by Woodward against Hofstadter very well, and he knows that his definition doesn't apply to the late 19th century. And he does something here very interesting. He bites the bullet and says, the only party in political history that called itself populist does not count as populist by my definition. So you can see the kind of tangle these people find themselves in. They've come up with a definition that clearly explains something of their contemporary age, but once they project that back into the late 19th century, the framework completely breaks down. And again, you have this sense of culture shock in which the American and European conversations are completely at odds. Now, this is when I move on to my second point, where I want to say populism discourse, or the way Europeans talk about populism, is obviously not just a result of one big academic con. It's not just that academics created this really popular word, populism, to get research grants or to get research projects going. There's obviously something in society, in Europe, out there, which is captured by the word populism. And this is actually the correlation we can see, but the more the word populism becomes popular in the last 30 years, you can actually let it correlate with a lot of other variables that I think explain the attraction of the word populism nowadays. And perhaps I think the best variables to contrast this popularity with are membership statistics for European parties in the last 30 years. What we see here is mainly membership parties on the left. So on the top, you see the French Communist Party, who had 630,000 members in 1978. Then it went into government with Mitterrand in the early 1980s. It lost quite a lot of members. But in 1998, it was reduced actually to 200,000 members. Then you had the PCI in Italy, which really was the biggest communist party in Western Europe, which had almost 2 million members in 1980. 1989, before the fall of the wall, it went down to 1.4 million. And then in 1998, it's already been halved to 600,000, and it actually fuses with the Democratic Party in Italy afterwards, so the party doesn't exist anymore. Even the PCI in Spain, which used to be quite big, has actually lost really, really lots of support. This even holds for Social Democrats. So the SPD in Germany has almost 1 million in 1980, then it goes to 900,000 in 1989, it goes to 660,000. And actually there are now predictions that maybe the next decade, the oldest party in Europe, which is the SPD, might actually disappear from the electoral map. So they've just elected a new leadership, we'll see what happens, but it looks very likely that they're in a kind of terminal crisis. And this doesn't only hold for political parties. So other components of what used to be called a left-wing civil society are in a very, very heavy decline. So union membership in Europe has declined dramatically in the last 30 years. France used to have a union rate which is quite high in the 1980s, now it's down to 8%. So I don't think we should underestimate that the strikes that are happening in France are quite impressive now, but it's actually a heavily under-unionized population. That even all these other institutions within the left-wing civil society, such as working man associations or neighborhood clubs, have really atrophied completely. Now, the thing is, this is not an exclusively left-wing problem. And so it's not only political parties on the left that have lost members. So this is in Dutch, I do apologize for that. But it gives us actually statistics for several parties on the right in the Netherlands. So the VVD, for example, which are the Dutch liberals, they went from 59,000 to 37,000 in 2009. They've only gone lower ever since. And even the Christian Democrats are suffering a very, very steep decline. So what you have across Europe is a deep, deep and pervasive crisis of party democracy. All these institutions or intermediary bodies that used to mediate individuals' relationship to the state, that also used to assure equal access to state institutions, have been completely soon shut and actually are non-accessible anymore. And I think the best example of this are still the British Tories. So now you can see a disgraced political figure on my left, who we've almost forgotten about, given that she's been replaced by an even more spectacular buffoon. But I think we really need to take stock of just how dramatic the decline of the Tory party has been. The first thing to remind ourselves is the Tory party is actually the first mass party in Western Europe. It was founded before the SPD, before the social democratic movement started voting. The Democrats in America are more complicated, but they have a very specific party experience, so you can't really compare them with the experience of democratization. But in the late 19th century, the Tories, or the British Conservatives, actually built one of the first mass parties in Western Europe. And they did so by, they have neighborhood associations, so what you see on the right is this kind of conservative club. If you go around Britain and you go into little towns, you'll actually find one of those conservative clubs almost in the entirety of southern England. Even in the north, every town has conservative clubs. And up to the 1950s, the Tories actually more members than Labour did. So what Labour had is that they had loads of trade union attachés, which means that if you were part of a trade union, you'd automatically also be a part of the Labour Party. You'd have a vote in the conference. But even then, the Tory party still had more members. Now actually they're back to 160,000 members, of which the average age is now estimated at almost 77. So it's a kind of elevated social club for retirees. It's where you go for the Rotary Club. And its funding structure has also changed accordingly. As you see here, last year it received more funding from people who are dead than they are living. So the way this works is that so many members of the Conservative Party die that they leave money behind in their wills towards the Conservative Party. But you can see that as a party, that's not a sustainable business model. If you just have to rely on people dying, well, I think you have to reconfigure your strategy. So the way they actually now gather their money is not through these small foundations from Little England, neither is it from classical British industrial capital. They've mainly relied on offshore foundations. So what offshore capital does, Russian capital, but also Far Eastern capital, Saudi capital, actually parks most of its capital in London, lets it sink into real estate assets mainly. It actually buys up the Tories by saying, if you protect my assets in London, then I will give you campaign funds. And they have. So Russian oligarchs have funneled enormous amounts of money into the Tory party. But interestingly enough, the Tories don't use this money to actually rebuild the mass party. They have massive amounts of donations. But what they have done with their donations is that they've mainly pumped it in really cheap PR, they've pumped it into Facebook ads, they've pumped it into all kinds of PR tactics, and a lot of it looks very close to what we know with Fox News here in the US. So I don't know whether you saw this, but Boris Johnson released a speech where they built a kind of brick wall which had Brexit deadlock on it, and then he drove with a tractor through this wall. This was posted on the Twitter page, and this was supposed to exemplify his capacity to break Brexit stalemate. But this is basically what they're doing with their money. They're buying tractors and breaking down walls. But I think there's no more acute symptom of the decline of party democracy than this particular party. And as I said, they're just a proxy of a more general trend here. In France, the right is completely on the decline. In Germany, the CDU is being eaten away by the AfD. In the Netherlands, the liberals are being outflanked by more right-wing contenders. And all across Europe, actually, these classical traditional parties are in steep, steep decline. Now, it is very, very obvious how this decomposition of classical party democracy in Europe links up with the popularity of the word populism. So what populism captures is that all the classical social markers that structured mass politics in the 20th century are completely being eroded. So people don't necessarily identify as workers anymore. They don't identify as Christians. I mean, classical religiosity has declined very dramatically as well. They don't either identify as sort of employers, but they're mainly part of market-driven subcultures which can readily be manipulated by PR. And the Irish political scientist Peter Maher has neatly described this as leading to a situation in which politicians rule the void. So you have a void between citizens and the state, and there's all kinds of tactics you can use to now bridge that gap, but in essence there are no institutions available anymore for citizens. So this creates a very, very volatile electoral environment. You have no core base of voters anymore, so both everyone and no one actually becomes a potential voter. What you do for policy is that you outsource it to technocratic bodies because you don't want to justify yourself to a base anymore, because that might make you unpopular in the polling statistics. And this disorganized society also makes it very, very difficult for parties to build up a solid voting clientele. So there are several statistics on it I could have cited, but you can clearly see that across Europe, people are losing their loyalty to parties. They're switching very, very quickly between parties, and there's just no reassurance that someone will vote for you in the next election if they did in the previous one. And what this leads to, I think, and this is a very particular point, is that it's really a question today whether we should really still speak about mass politics. So we know mass politics as a phenomenon that completely set out the political history of the 20th century, but it's not entirely clear that that category still applies today. And one example I always give here is from the British journalist Paul Mason, who's quite an interesting Twitter character, I know. But this is actually from the latest Brexit negotiations, and he posted this after Theresa May lost another parliamentary vote. And so he said, like, Brexit, in case it's not obvious, last night Theresa May lost the last vestige of control over the process. There are three agents now: the EU, Parliament, and the masses. It's a very, very strange statement. There have been several marches on Parliament. There has been certain forms of agitation around Brexit, but you could not potentially claim that the masses have any control over this Brexit process. What Brexit has exposed instead is there is a massive gap between the British population and the political class, in which there is a representative lag, and politicians actually don't know how to relate to their bases anymore. And actually the main solution to this problem, if you don't have access to voters through parties, is through speculation. So you start to speculate about a fabricated popular will, and what you do is that you outsource this question to spin doctors, or you look for several PR agencies to do that. So other channels must be tapped. So instead of listening to a base or obeying a party machinery, politicians become ever more ensnared by an army of spin doctors. And this has also led to a very specific way, or specific change in how European societies are governed. So what you've seen since the late 1990s is a split between what you could call policy and politics. So policy is the way states intervene in their economies. Policy is the way states relate to other states. It's the kind of hard work of getting legislation through Parliament. It's basically how states enact their power. And then politics is the form of what you could call popular will formation. That is competition between parties. It's how parties posit themselves vis-a-vis voters, and this form of popular will formation then enacts itself in policy. So what has happened since the 1990s in Europe is that politics and policy have been completely uncoupled from each other. Policy has become the exclusive domain of technocrats. You can think of central banks or several international organizations, while politics has become mediatized and digitalized and actually become subject to a very, very volatile, media sphere. And what I'd like to do next is actually focus more closely on how this has conditioned the rise of these new political movements, both on the left and the right, which are often called populist. So what we see here is Alexis Tsipras and Pablo Iglesias, really the most famous examples of the left populist wave we've seen in the last 10 years. And what is very, very specific about both Tsipras and Podemos, is that they both had to deal with this fact of disorganization. So parties are in decline, unions are in decline, and they had to face up to the situation in which there was an economic crisis. There was massive discontent in both Greek and Spanish society, but there were no institutions really available to translate that discontent into concrete policy. And what they've mainly done is that they've tried to build political parties on the basis of the disorganization without rebuilding civil society itself. And part of the ways they've done that is through classical modes of PR. They've played very heavily on some of these nationalist logics, and they've actually tried to build a populist politics on the basis of disorganization. One of the main inspirations they've used for this is the Argentinian theorist Ernesto Laclau. So Ernesto Laclau is really known as the prime theorist of left populism. He mainly had his political experience in Argentina, but he served as a point of inspiration both for Syriza and also for Podemos. What is very, very important for Laclau's theory of populism is that it's both based on an appeal to identity and it's based on an appeal to the leader. And you can actually see how this goes hand in hand with the structural changes that have occurred in European party politics in the last 30 years. So the existence of a void between citizens and states makes it more difficult to communicate to voters through classical representative channels. So the result is a form of political marketing in which these leaders appeal to voters and actually say, what I've been saying is what you wanted all along. And there was a very famous example of this in the late 1990s with the Dutch political leader Pim Fortuyn, who actually has a slogan which says, he says what we are thinking. Hij zegt wat wij denken. And then he had a rally, and you had all these voters who attended the rally. And there was a certain moment at which a journalist went around in the room and asked, so why do you like Pim Fortuyn? What is your attraction to Pim Fortuyn? Most of the voters said, well, I mean, because of the slogan, he said what we're thinking. And then they asked him, like, well, yeah, what are you thinking? He's like, well, of course, what he says. But this is the classical feedback loop you get in this kind of disorganized politics. It is impossible for people to preconceive of their interests before they're articulated by a leader. And here we can also see how this Laclauian model of left populism is really a marked contrast with 20th century mass parties. These mass parties consistently rooted their representative claim in a very specific sociological segment of society. So left-wing parties advocated workers' interests, liberal parties spoke for a section of the bourgeoisie or the petite bourgeoisie, while Christian Democrats, for example, saw themselves as defending a society of persons and families. In such a setting, actually, a strong leader is of secondary importance because it is the rank and file of that party that is at the center of the party. Now, populist parties such as Podemos and Syriza face a completely different situation. They have a different hierarchy of interest, and they have to fight themselves into politics in a heavily mediatized public sphere. So left populism's reliance on this leader and its reliance on identity is actually a symptom of what the political theorist Pierre Rosanvallon has called the desocialization of Western societies. All these classical categories that structured mass politics across the 20th century have completely been eroded. And there are actually several ways in which left populists have sought to navigate this question of the erosion of classical social categories. So one of the biggest problems left populism has faced is what you could call the partial death of, or the partial void described by Peter Mayer before. So there is a void between citizen and the state, but it's taken quite a while for all these classical party systems to completely disappear. So people still continue to vaguely vote on a class basis. Some of the trade unions have survived, and once this kind of residual social market survives, it's very difficult for left populists to step into the scene and represent a people against the elite. We can think, for example, of the Spanish socialists who are now surviving against Podemos, or we think of the Belgian union movement, which is actually still quite large. So this incomplete void has also meant that left populist achievements in politics in the last 10 years tended to be more rhetorical than institutional. So Podemos actually wanted to eat up the Socialist Party. They wanted to do a so-called sorpasso, and this failed. Jean Mélenchon wanted to build one big anti-Macron bloc, and this didn't work either. And usually after that happened, they tried to make some kind of institutional settlement with mainstream parties. This actually meant that they had to move away from this opposition between the people and the elite, and they actually had to position themselves on a left-right axis. So they can't go beyond left and right anymore, and they actually They have to say, well, we are a left-wing party, or we are a right-wing party. So this dynamic has become very, very painfully visible in the case of Podemos. So Podemos had its first electoral setback in 2015, and then the party entered a period of internal turbulence. So maybe some people know this. There's one section of the party who's more populist, led by Íñigo Errejón, and you have another party which is more openly socialist, led by Pablo Iglesias. Oh, Jesus. Yeah, perfect. And actually, Íñigo Errejón recently split out from this party because he disagreed with the kind of new radical left strategy embodied by them. And this actually shows that there are two problems these left populists face in a contemporary setting. So in one sense, left populism is still too left. So it cannot fully profit from the breakdown of the classical party system, and it's unable to embrace what's called a catch-all approach. So what you can see, for example, with the five-star movement in Italy is that it left behind any references to left and right, and it just positioned itself as a representative of the people against the elite. So it's really a party of the many against the few, but it has no reference to an ideological prehistory where it says, we are a left-wing party. It's a very unstable mix of both left-wing and right-wing elements. The difference with Podemos and Iglesias mainly is that it constantly found itself drawn back to its radical left heritage. So opponents called it communist. It itself had very strong ties to the former Communist Party. And this meant that it could not fully embrace its populist approach. And what you can see now with the government that's recently been formed in Spain is that Iglesias has basically positioned himself as a left-wing pressure group on the left wing of the Social Democratic Party. They're now calling it 14%, the Socialists at 24%. Although they had a populist episode for the last 4 years, they've actually not managed to consolidate it in anything concrete. It's now just a force that tries to steer the Social Democrats to the left. And this also means that its voting base has become way narrower. It's mainly professionals that vote for Podemos now, although it used to have a sizable working class base before. But it's really become a sort of downward PMC party in the last 2 years. So what we can also see at the same time, though, is that left populism is also too populist. So it thins out its commitment to a previous socialist tradition, and it actually skips over some key organizational questions. And Syriza is the best example of this. Syriza got elected into office to get rid of European austerity programs, and it thought that by introducing this legislation and by engaging in a confrontation with the Eurozone, it would actually be able to get that. What it saw, however, is that it lacked the organizational capacity within Greek society to actually force this change on the state. So it was incredibly effective at mobilizing people. I mean, 100,000 people showed up on the squares when they were holding their referendum, but it didn't actually have enough social power to force a different political economy on Greece in the late 19th century. And this shows that there's really a kind of catch-22 for left populists. Either you become too left and you risk not winning out these populist voters, or you become too populist and you actually don't build enough social power to actually force change on society. What you see now is that you have forms of protest such as the Gilets jaunes in France, or the foundation of a Nationalist International, the foundation of the Brexit vote in Britain, that completely befuddle and confuse them. They don't know how to position themselves vis-à-vis these movements. Also because it had never a coherent organizational theory. So the question I want to ask now is there maybe a different way of thinking out populism that is available historically? Although left populism has its virtues, it actually tries to take stock of a new situation, it also has intrinsic limits. What we've seen in the last 2 years is that those left populists' problems have become very, very explicit. And actually, if we go back to America, where Richard Hofstadter wrote his first book about, we can see there's a very, very different way of thinking about populism that is available in America. We can think, for example, the way Bernie Sanders talks about his populist past, how he has no problem positioning himself as a populist, which shows that this is not the European way of using the word populism. There's also an interesting portrait in Sanders' office in the Senate, which is of Eugene V. Debs. It's actually the personal history of Eugene V. Debs that really shows a specific connection between class, interest, and organizational politics you see in the American case. So in the early 1890s, Debs was still a member of the Democratic Party, although he was already a trade unionist, a radical trade unionist, he was still a loyal Democrat. It's actually in 1892 that it decides to run over to the populist, and it becomes an open populist. And Debs is actually a very, very clear example how this early populist movement culminated in the socialist agitation of the early 20th century. And what's so specific about this original populist movement is that, firstly, it was a highly organizational movement. It didn't just start as a party. It began with cooperatives and neighborhood associations in the American South in the 1880s and 1890s, where you had farmer cooperatives who tried to depress prices. They then joined up with trade unions. It was only in the late 1880s when they realized that this cooperative approach had its limits that they decided to ascend to party formation. So the party, or the Populist Party of the 1890s, was built on top of a very, very rich cooperative subculture. So the idea is, like, once you have power on the level of society, you have all these cooperatives, you have a counter economy that can actually fight the corporate economy, then it was possible to also form a party at the time. And the real success of American populism, mainly in the American South, was also precisely because it didn't appeal to the classical identity categories that were so prevalent in the 1880s and 1890s. So we have to take into account this is a time after Reconstruction, so the Second American Revolution has already been crushed. The majority of Southerners are either stuck in sharecropping or they're stuck in rising tenantry. Landlessness is on the rise, and you have a planter class that is powerful, but it has no full grip on society yet. Southern society is already fairly segregated, but it's not completely segregated. And there's actually quite a lot of biracial cooperation in the 1880s. And the genius of the American populist movement in the late 1880s, it was precisely that it was able to transcend the racial divides between black and white farmers and unite them in a cooperative movement. And what we see is an attempt to unite all Southerners on the basis of economic interest through all these organizational solutions in cooperatives and different ventures. So I want to return to the Southern historian C. Van Woodward, who said, whatever concern the farmers might have had for their status was overwhelmed by desperate and immediate economic anxieties. Not only their anxieties, but their proposed solutions and remedies were economic. While their legislative program may have often been naive and slightly inadequate, it was almost obsessively economic, and as political platforms go, little more irrational than run-of-the-mill. Now, once you have black and white farmers organizing in the American South in the 1880s and then forming a party in the 1890s, the response on behalf of the planter class of the South is extremely, extremely fierce. So they realize that this biracial coalition that's constructed as populism is a real, real challenge to the plantation system. And what they decide to do is, well, we'll first crush them through intimidation, we'll stuff the ballot boxes, and we'll just gun down populist legislators, but in the long term, we actually have to think about a more durable solution. What they do in the late 1890s, after populism begins losing its election, is that they hold a series of constitutional conventions in the late 1890s. So loads of southern states get new constitutions, and all those constitutions actually include poll taxes. Poll taxes imply that if you want to vote, you have to pay a certain fee. There is also literacy tests that are introduced. And interestingly enough, of course, they disenfranchise the entirety of the southern black population, and they are actually the institutional beginning of Jim Crow. But what they also know is that, well, I mean, it's not just black farmers who were radical in the 1880s and 1890s. There's also white farmers who took part in the populist movement. And those disenfranchisement proposals actually numerically disenfranchise more poor whites in the South than they do poor blacks. So the entirety of the black population is disenfranchisement, but there's a large majority of poor whites in the South who also lose their vote. What happens after these constitutional conventions is that the sharecropping system and the tenantry system completely disappear and are steadily replaced by a system that's really a classical form of agrarian capitalism. So you have landlords, you have tenants, and then you have employers. And this was the solution to the biracial threat of the 1890s. So the economic historian Charles Post has summarized this very well. He said, in the wake of the defeat of the Southern Farmers Alliance and the imposition of Jim Crow in the South, planters were able to begin to reorganize cotton production along capitalist lines. The balance began to shift in favor of centrally supervised wage labor after 1890. While planters continued to refer to their wage laborers as croppers and even as tenants, these workers did not supervise their own labor. Instead, they worked under the supervision of the planter in centralized gangs. In the first 4 decades of the 20th century, the planters' ability to organize the labor process under their command and fire workers at will allowed them to progressively mechanize southern agriculture. C. Van Woodward has compressed this statement quite a lot, and he says, it took a lot of ritual and Jim Crow to bolster the creed of white supremacy in the bosom of a white man working for a black man's wages. So what I'd like to end on is a sort of call to enrich our political imagination and to step away from some of the usual habits we have when talking about populism today. Populism today is usually associated with leader-centric movements. They're heavily dependent on leaders. They're very bad at organization. They take disorganization for granted. They often work through PR tactics, and they find it massively difficult to actually build up social power. If we look at the late 19th century, however, this completely falsifies this narrative. American populism was heavily organizational. It was not based around leaders. It was not based around identity. And it was actually able to mount a very, very sustained challenge to the rising Jim Crow system in the 1890s, as we can see with the mass disenfranchisement, not only of Southern blacks, but also of Southern whites. So what I'd like us to do is not transplant this vision of the late 19th century today. That is obviously impossible. But I'd like us to think a lot harder that when we talk about populism today, there might be some historical alternatives out there that might also make certain things we don't call populist nowadays actually seem more populist than they really are. But that is all I will say on the matter for now, and I bet we have loads to discuss in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anton, for that really fascinating discussion on populism. I have some questions, but I will open it up to you guys as well. So I guess I wanted to start with maybe the present and then move backwards and then forwards. So you talk about, you trace the genealogy of the term populism and reveal, how far it's come from its original meaning. And that now confused term allows people to call politicians like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both as populists. But what I find interesting about that is that both would probably resist that identification. And I'm curious about kind of why you think that is, and whether or not that's changed over time. So, are there European politicians who would proclaim themselves populists?
Yeah, for example, for the American case, it's very clear that it's easier for politicians to claim the populist mantle, but it doesn't have a lot of concrete social content for it. So someone like Warren can call herself populist, although it's not very clear what's actually implied with it, except for a sort of folksy anti-elite style. But I mean, we know that every politician who's running for election will adopt this anti-elite posture, so I don't think there's any reason to presume it has any content to it. What you see in Europe, however, is that when politicians actually adopt the label populist, it's a kind of, you could call it a sort of reappropriation. So usually what happens is they get called populist and they say, like, what do you mean if you call me a populist? And then the journalist usually says, well, someone who's for the people, and then the politicians inevitably embrace it because they see it as a way to give themselves some popular credentials. And there's a very explicit example of this of the French far-right politician Jean-Marie Le Pen, who actually until the 1980s is never called a populist. It's only from the mid-1980s that starts to rise. And then journalists start to use the word mainly because they like it as an alternative to fascism. Fascism is overheated, it's too polemical, historically it doesn't seem to work anymore. And there's a very famous interview in the early 1990s where Jean-Marie Le Pen is asked by a journalist, do you consider yourself a populist? Jean-Marie Le Pen responds and says, well, I mean, what do you mean by the word populism? And the journalist walks right into the trap and says, like, well, I mean, a populist is supposedly someone who speaks for the people. And Jean-Marie Le Pen grabs it and says, like, yeah, I mean, if speaking for the people means I'm a populist, then I'm obviously a populist. Right? So it had a very, very peculiar dynamic in Europe, also legitimizing part of the far right as supposedly a popular working class force.
Thank you for that. So one of the interesting things that you described is that we're at this weird moment where there's been this kind of utter erosion of institutions. And you mentioned that people no longer identify as Christians, workers, or petty bourgeois engineers. And this probably accounts for the rise in populism on the left and the right. But at the same time, you mentioned that people still continue to vote along traditional party lines. So I wanted you to like flesh that out a little bit and talk about that contradiction. Are we in a particularly, important moment historically?
Yeah, so I will say this is very specific to Europe. I don't think I can generalize towards American politics here. But what I tried to describe with the situation of a partial void is that party democracy in Europe has collapsed, but it survives in a sort of zombified form. So the way I often use that term metaphorically is you can think of a tree that still stands and the tree sustains a whole superstructure. But when you look at the roots have been completely hollowed out and they're completely rotten. So it's not that parties have disappeared. Parties still supply the personnel for states. Parties still make sure that states can govern in a sort of representative way. But their grip on society has become incredibly weak. So the reason people still vote for certain parties, not because they're members of those parties, but out of a sense of protracted loyalty, or say like, this is the party I've always voted for. And this is the kind of dilemma left populists have, is that parties are no longer rooted in society, but they still have too much of a grip of society to just snatch away those older voters. And one of the ways right-wing populists have proven very, very effective at exploiting that situation is that they've actually combined older party models with new forms of digital communication. So we can think, for example, of the Lega Nord in Italy, which was really a northern regionalist party that was founded in the 1990s to just stave off southern leeches and to be like, well, we want nothing to do with the South and we don't want to pay for all these lazy, non-working Italians in the South. They're not even Italians in a way, they're all Africans, is what they say. But the genius of Salvini, who's now one of the most popular politicians in Italy, is that he got rid of the North, so he turned the Lega Nord into just the Lega. He kept all the cadre in the North and said, like, we'll rely on these people to have a solid voting clientele, but we'll also build up a massive digital apparatus to get voters in the South. So what you're seeing now is a very, very weird development where a region is starting to vote for a party that was historically founded to push them out of Italy. So southern Italians are voting for a party that was founded against them. And it's precisely because Salvini has been able to combine this classical party model in the north with the new populist party model in the south, mainly based on PR and Facebook ads. And this is really what explains his electoral success as well. He knows that this hybrid is what works well because the void is never complete.
That's really interesting. Okay, I can't resist kind of bringing us to the present a little bit. So you talk about the kind of weaknesses of left populists like Podemos that are very leader-centric movements. And of course, there are other leader-centered movements that have emerged recently, like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. I think it's like the 12th in Britain right now. So we're all kind of like twiddling our thumbs. But I'm kind of curious if you feel like the movements that have kind of been mobilized around these leaders are doing something different, or if, invariably they will kind of fall into the same traps that other left populists fall into.
So again, I think the American and European situation are not completely comparable, and they're not equivalent. What's specific about the American party system is that parties are not really representative institutions, they're just state departments. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are just fifth and third, the fifth and fourth wing of the state. So they've never really had mass membership. They've always been extremely top-down, which means that the way you organize a movement will inevitably be centered around a kind of leader that tries to capture the leadership of a particular party. And since you also have a presidential system, inevitably presidential systems tend to reinforce movements that are very leader-centric. Nonetheless, I mean, there's a question in the Bernie coalition everyone is asking, which is like, even if he gets into office and he wants to enact this agenda, he has so much discretionary power. But, I mean, can he sustain this kind of challenge on the level of society? I mean, if you want to expropriate certain companies, you'll have a state apparatus on your side, but is it actually possible to mobilize parts of society against it as well? So this is where leader-centrism becomes a problem. In the case of Corbyn, there's a real question whether Corbynism without Corbyn exists. Yes, so imagine if Corbyn dies tomorrow. Not dies, sorry, loses the election, I hope. maybe that's what happens, he'll disappear into the void. Yeah, so I'm reasonably optimistic. I went canvassing for Labour myself, where I'm heavily invested in a libidinal sense in them winning tomorrow. I cannot handle another 5 years of Tory rule. But there's a real question, and it's now the biggest party in Western Europe. They have 600,000 members, but the members they have are not like the classical members they had in the 50s and 60s. They're people who have been drawn in mainly on a digital basis. They have a kind of conditional support to the party. They mainly like Corbyn, but they started to dislike Corbyn once he started to vacillate on the Brexit question. And it just shows that as long as you have a party in which the leader can mobilize people, but people don't stay in the party except for that leader, you're subject to a kind of volatility that is very, very dangerous. And if he loses tomorrow, which I think is unlikely, but if he loses tomorrow, there'll probably be a leadership contest, and I'm not entirely sure the Corbynites have a better candidate to offer. You'll probably have someone who's a compromise candidate, and I think that candidate will steer away the Labour Party from its current course and turn it into the kind of lifeless husk all those other social democratic parties have become.
Okay. All right, well, I have some more questions, but let me turn it to the audience. Yeah, Dustin.
So you talked about the weaknesses of left populism in Europe, but there's been mixed success, right? And what explains the differences between, like, Sarah Wagenknecht's inability to get even a left populist project off the ground, whereas Podemos' ability to make the Socialist Party in Spain utterly humiliated in one election cycle? Like, how is there such radical differences when there's such similarities both in the social conditions and in how these left populists present themselves?
Yes, very good question. So I wouldn't say that the cause of decline for all these left populists is all perfectly equivalent. There are a lot of different causal drivers for each of these processes. What I will say, the first factor is just political economy. The way the 2009-2010 crisis was experienced in Germany was completely different from the way it was experienced in Spain. Spain saw almost complete evisceration of its public sector. Spanish society is also more disorganized, so there's just less membership. It has a weaker union movement. And this means that for someone like Wagenknecht to engage on this populist route is just far more difficult because civil society is more recalcitrant. Add to that the fact that you have a federal system, that you have an SPD that still has some kind of mass membership, that has already been implicated with austerity for 20 years. They've become used to governing as an austerity party. This makes it very difficult to actually enter the arena as a populist. What Podemos faced was a situation in both the center-right and the center-left were completely delegitimized by their implication with the austerity regime. So even the Socialist Party started to govern as an austerity party. This was a kind of historical break. This was real PASOKification, as it's called. They started to look like a mere left wing of capital in that case. And because the Socialist Party also has a weaker grip on Spanish society, this meant that Podemos initially had more success. They could posit themselves as a radical alternative to a socialist party that clearly sold out, while in the case of Wagenknecht, this question was more difficult. But at the same time, as I say, they've exploited volatility initially, but now they've become the victim of volatility, and they've basically went back to a much smaller, professional base in the end.
I wanted you to speak a little bit about the relationship of populism to co-option by larger parties within the state, because populist movements obviously face opposition, but they also face co-option by many parties. Yes. The Populist Party, a lot of those elements end up in the kind of William Jennings Bryan, My Democratic Party. Yeah. If you look at something like Brexit, historically part of the British left, then becomes a kind of populist right-wing issue. Like at Brexit, I'm a little more pessimistic than you. I really hope we're all going to wake up on Friday morning in a very different situation than I think we are.
That's not
the likelihood is Brexit is going to happen under one of the major two parties in Britain. And even in the US, you see, like, MSNBC commentators go to Bernie Sanders, well, why are you running? Like, everyone in the Democratic Party believes in Medicare for all now. So there's this way in which populist causes or populist parties get co-opted by mainstream movements. So is there a long-term longevity for populist movements? How can that happen outside of that?
I think there's a difference between the left and the right. So what I will say about the 1890s is it's true, the populists get co-opted, but it's not a particularly pleasant co-optation. So the platform gets watered down, some of the policies enacted in the early 19th century in the progressive era, but populism really loses its bet for power. I mean, the populist vision of this cooperative commonwealth, as often called, is actually never enacted. I think that on the right, there are actually some populist parties now who are very, very consistent and recalcitrant, and who've actually managed to survive quite long. You just need to look at, for example, Poland or Hungary. I mean, Orban started his political career as a liberal, then saw that there was a kind of populist base to exploit, and he's really, really fortified his grip on Hungarian society. So I think there's a kind of populist governance style that means you don't necessarily need to get co-opted. You can have very nasty results, but you'll survive. And I think partly the reason Orban has been successful is because he's had wholesale support on behalf of Hungarian capital and on behalf of German capital. What he offers in Hungary is Chinese wages in the orbit of German capital. So, I mean, German industry doesn't want to pay high wages, so he just sends all his industry to Hungary. And this, I mean, this is just, he has accommodated himself to Hungarian capital and the European capital very easily. The problem with left populists is that they actually want to transform parts of Europe's political economy, so their standard is much higher. So what happens in the case of co-optation is not necessarily that they sell out, it's just that the criteria for success is much higher. And then inevitably, because their criteria for success is higher, they settle for lower scores. So, I mean, Podemos wanted a raise of the minimum wage from 600 to 1,200 per month, so they wanted to double. And now they basically settled for 800, which I guess is a raise, but it's nowhere near the kind of increase they actually saw initially. And it's not insignificant, but it's very, very difficult to sell that to your base as a big, big success story. So I think the question of co-optation really relates to the question, how far are you willing to challenge capital? Orban hasn't been willing to do it. I mean, he's accommodating himself, while left populists have way more ambitious plans.
Start there, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as a relationship between the 19th century Populist Party and Jim Crow, and generally their relationship to existing forms of identity and culturally embedded similarities. My understanding was that populists had kind of a conflicted, ambiguous relationship to Jim Crow, to race, and that some of the state parties actually were racially exclusionary. There was an attempt to transcend them in the South, but eventually Thomas Watson gave up and kind of said, okay, let's get blacks out of politics. And we can
Of course, yeah.
And more generally, that a lot of the populist movement was kind of expressing these long-running religious currents. So I'm just wondering if that has any implications for the potential, for populism to kind of transcend or be independent of.
Yeah. So I absolutely do not want to overplay the degree of biracialism within original populism. So as I said, this movement arises in the aftermath of Reconstruction. It's already facing a polity that's being segregated in very, very significant ways. It has significant biracial cooperation, but it's also a segregated movement in many senses. But it's partly also, there was a big, like, populism was not just a white movement, there was a black populism. The problem was just that you had two separate populist movements that cooperated on a narrow interest basis, actually constituted quite a significant challenge to planter rule, but that obviously didn't go as far as full social equality. So this, as I said, they went for full political equality, they didn't go for full social equality. What I will say is that the kind of dilemma a lot of white populists face in the 1890s vis-a-vis the Democratic Party is, you say, either you keep blacks in your coalition and we'll take away your civil rights, or either you can keep your civil rights, but then the precondition for this is that you agree with disenfranchisement on a larger scale. And this is actually the calculus a lot of them make. So no matter how biracially ambitious they are, they say, okay, but when I'm faced with this choice, I will go for my own civil rights and I will comply with this request. And the biggest tragedy of the constitutional conventions I mentioned in the late 1890s that actually codify all these poll taxes is that they're voted in by plebiscites, and the majority of people who vote in these plebiscites are former white populists. So, I mean, it's a classic case of false consciousness where the Democrats basically tell them, vote in this constitutional convention, and, as they say, black votes will never be used again to crush your populist vote. And what happens, of course, in the 1900s is that this coherent white community survives, and you have the revival of a kind of New South creed, but a lot of poor whites actually lose their vote. We shouldn't forget that, like, most of these statues that are now being torn down in the South, of all these Confederate generals, were not constructed right after the war. Most of them were actually constructed in the 1900s and the 1910s as a way to culturally solidify the Jim Crow regime. So it was the attempt to create a kind of homogeneous white community with a perfect equivalence of interest between planters and poor whites, to give the sense of, like, okay, you might have lost your civil rights. You're not allowed to vote anymore. You've lost an immense amount of social rights as well, insofar as your wages are miserable. But still, there is this cultural compensation where they say, like, but at least you fought for the old cause, and at least you should fight for the old cause now. So what I'd say is, like, yeah, the odds they faced were very, very slim, and they didn't make it. But there were, let me rephrase it this way, they didn't have all the right answers, but they did ask the right questions. And I think a lot of people today are not even asking the right questions about populism in that sense.
Yeah, so what was really interesting, you know, the example you gave about Dutch voters who said, you know, I like him because he says what I'm thinking, and what I'm thinking is what he says. And that struck me as very sort of reminiscent or similar to, like, Mark Fisher's conception of capitalist realism, placing limits on the imagination of people, what they think being their possibilities. And I wanted to ask, what do you see as being the sort of causes of that, and how is that related to also what you described of the sort of void of institutions that mediate between the state and society? How do you see, how did that void develop, and what were the sort of material causes of that loss?
I think I'll be really boring, and I'll just summarize it in one word, which is neoliberalism. But I think we underestimate just how disenchanted politics has become under neoliberalism. So the challenge neoliberalism faces in the 1970s and 1980s is not only to change a growth regime, but it also has to get rid of all these ties that connect interest groups to the state. So the big problem of governance neoliberalism faces, and you see this in the public choice literature, is like you have all these partisan specialist interests that want these claims on the state. What we actually need to do is remove people from democratic politics and make it easier for people to govern without democratic constraints. The thing is, they first destroyed this socialist civil society, but in the end, actually the same happens to this right-wing civil society. And this means that mass party democracy declines, it disappears, and the only way people can still think of democratic influence is through the market. So you have all these market-based theories of democracy, which are basically like, well, if you want to change any political issue, the way you do it is through consumer sovereignty. As a consumer, you're sovereign, you make your own decisions on the market. If you disagree with a certain question, you can just exercise that power as a consumer. But you can see this very, very clearly with, for example, something like Extinction Rebellion in the UK, whose vision of the climate crisis is completely disenchanted. Their idea is basically to get a bunch of technocrats into the British state who will declare a climate emergency. You'll have a people's assembly who might deliberate on some of these questions. But, I mean, the project is literally to replace one set of technocrats with another set of technocrats. And this shows just how narrow people's democratic imagination has really become. I think the good thing about the Labour Party is that it shows like all these classical mass party tactics of the 20th century have not been completely superseded. But neoliberalism has not only materially, but also cognitively affected our capacity to think about democratic change. So, I mean, the classic example of this, if you want to solve global warming through a change in consumer behavior, then, I mean, yeah, you can see where this is going, nowhere.
I'm going to ask one question and then bring it back to the audience. But one thing that relates to is when you were talking about Podemos and Syriza, you know, it seemed like you mentioned that they kind of benefited from the volatility, but then they suffered from it. And I was curious if there was a moment where, there was a real choice that they faced, where they could, attempt to reinstitutionalize in some form, and then made the wrong choice, or were many of their choices, ultimately constrained by political and economic factors, the kind of historical and political conditions. Like, where was their leeway, and where did they take the wrong road if they did?
Yeah, I think you're playing with very, very dangerous counterfactuals here, insofar as I don't want to make strong predictions of like it would have gone different. I think the odds faced both by Podemos and certainly Syriza were so tough that I don't think it's possible to say they betrayed anyone at a certain point. I think Syriza did make a massive mistake and they failed miserably. But it's not like there was a big act of betrayal, because an act of betrayal actually implies a very big promise, and I don't think that promise was there initially. So what I'd say is that the most promising left populist experiments have actually happened within classical parties themselves. So the promise of Corbynism is precisely that it hijacked a classical social democratic party and it reinvigorated a party that was considered completely hopeless. That it's also maintained a degree of institutional viability that these other left populists never had access to. Because the Blairites might hate Corbyn, all these party bureaucrats might dislike him, but he's the only person who's able to wield power within that party. So, yeah, the only way to make left populism viable, paradoxically, is by reviving moribund social democratic parties. I think that's a pretty stark but inevitable conclusion.
Maybe one more question, and then we'll...
Thank you. I want to bring Latin America in, as you said, you'd be willing to talk about it. I think it's this is great. I think the transatlantic perspective is super refreshing. Reading something like Move's recent book on Latin populism, it almost doesn't talk about anything outside of Western Europe. It's very frustrating. And it's one sentence on Latin America. And so thinking a bit through the Latin American experience, Venezuela in particular, as a way of maybe just at least wondering whether or not you're presenting some things that are a little more static than they ought to be. And to be clear, so for example, the decline in party identification, absolutely a general trend. But isn't part of the point of this precisely, and the intervention of populism to drive a stake through the hearts of those parties, in the case of Venezuela, to intervene actively to destroy a party system, as the basis for building something different. And this was the strategy of Podemos, which not incidentally Anton and others learned in Venezuela and elsewhere. And then, is this not get to like the second piece, I think, is that what you presented, I think, is a trade-off between leftism and populism within Podemos, between Anton and Iglesias, for me is a temporal distinction, right? Because the goal is precisely to use the populist momentum and moment to seize either power or a certain stake in society to then build and press the And it's like what happened with Podemos is they didn't get it, right? They didn't get it at the moment, they missed this opportunity, and so now you have a stalemate, which of course plays out, I think, in this way.
No, and I absolutely agree with that temporal reading. It's also how Lafleur reads is that you have a populist moment or opportunity, you can seize it, but then inevitably there's a mode of institutionalization, and you will have to move away from that oppositional axis, this oppositional way of framing politics. The only issue I have is that in the European case or in the Podemos case, the problem initially they have with the Indignados is that you have a base without a party. So the Indignados are very angry and they have legitimate grievances, but they have no way to translate this into actual coercion on the level of the state. And then the problem with Podemos initially just becomes that it becomes a party without a real base. So you have a populist moment, right? But then there's a moment of institutionalization. And if the only way you can institutionalize by becoming corporatist or by settling on a very narrow electoral base, this kind of squanders the initial promise of the populist moment, because the populist moment is about a majoritarian grip on society. Once you institutionalize, you supposedly lose this majoritarian grip on society. But, I mean, historically, there have been moments at which social democratic parties had their populist moment, but also managed to maintain a majoritarian grip even in government in that way. And what I will say about Latin America, although I'm absolutely not a specialist on it, and I'm probably generalizing quite a lot, but the problem with a lot of Latin American populist movement is precisely that some of the top-down and leader-centric elements make it very difficult to keep an organizational counterweight to threats that arise against a regime. So the centrality of the leader tends to demobilize the constituency, and you have to think of other ways of keeping this constituency mobilized. And there has to be a way in which you can both maintain a presence on the level of the state and a presence on the level of society. And I think the big problem all these Latin American populist movements have had is that this balance between these two moments is very, very difficult to maintain. And of course, I'm not saying they don't face massive external pressure that also exacerbates this imbalance. But it's a real organizational question, not only for Latin Americans, but also for Europeans, of like, how do you pull off this particular combination of both maintaining presence on the level of society and having a presence on the level of the state as well.
All right, well, let's give another round of applause to Anton.